The following is a project of our nonprofit newsroom. Support Midcoast Morning and local community-centered journalism today by signing up to be a monthly sustaining donor at chly.ca/donate. It doesn't take much money to support local news.
Hello and welcome to Midcoast Morning. I'm Joe Pugh. A documentary filmed on the front lines of what's been called Canada's largest act of civil disobedience is coming to Nanaimo. Fairy Creek, from director Jen Muranetz, tells stories from the anti-old-growth logging protest and blockade that began in 2020. The protest started after logging permits were granted to teal cedar products in an area that included Fairy Creek, northeast of Port Renfrew. Teal cedar products sought, and in April 2021 was granted an injunction against the protests. RCMP enforcement led to more than 1,100 arrests, which is what's led many to describe it as the largest act of civil disobedience in Canadian history. In 2021, the provincial government put a deferral on old-growth logging in parts of the Fairy Creek watershed. That deferral has since been extended multiple times, most recently until September of 2026. CBC reported that the RCMP spent more than $19 million on enforcement around Fairy Creek. I spoke with the documentary's filmmaker ahead of the Nanaimo screenings.
My name is Jen Muranetz, and I'm the director and one of the producers of the documentary film Fairy Creek.
And when you set out to make this documentary, what was your approach?
Well, first of all, I had no idea I was making a feature film at the time. When I first set out to make the documentary, I actually thought I was going to make maybe a 10 or 15-minute short film. And it was because everything was early on. There had been no injunction in place. There was no RCMP on the ground. And I had no idea that the movement would actually escalate and become this massive moment that is now referred to as Canada's largest act of civil disobedience.
Yeah, can you take me back there? Like, how did you get involved? How did you first hear something was going on at Fairy Creek back before the public at large really knew what Fairy Creek was?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I had a friend who started attending the blockade, and she asked me to come out and do some filming. And I was like, well, let me take a look into this. I'm not interested in coming out and just making something from, only as an activist. I want to make something a little bit more thorough, a little bit deeper. And I decided to just kind of trust my gut and go out to the blockade. For myself, my parents and my grandparents lived on Vancouver Island for a long time, so I have a deep connection to the island. I was living in Vancouver when this first happened. And I chose to move back to the island and just kind of see what happened with the idea of making what I thought was going to be a short film, a 10 or 15 minute long film. And I was going to be on the island for a couple of months and then go back and edit it. But what unfolded was something much larger as time went on and much more grandiose than I could have ever imagined. And so I arrived at the blockade, and at the time, many of the blockaders there were like, sure, you can be here and film, but we aren't really quite sure what you're looking to film or why you're even here in some regards. They were maybe used to some people coming out and doing a one-off interview, and they hadn't really had someone who wanted to come and embed themselves into the movement yet at that time. And so I stuck around. I got to know these people. I got to kind of understand some of their tactics. I got to see a lot of the early building and establishing of what the camp is. I got to see and witness their ethos evolve and their kind of mission. And I just continued watching and documenting from a very curious lens. I'm a filmmaker, but before that I was a journalist. And so I really try to approach my media from this space of just, I'm curious about all sides. And as time went on, it became apparent that this story was bigger than I could have ever imagined. And that continued to evolve as we kept up with the pace of it.
And the spine of the film is really what's going on at the blockade, what's going on kind of behind the front lines and at the front lines. You talked off the top about how you didn't want to set out and capture something necessarily from an activist's perspective only. I'm wondering what the community was like there, what the relationship aspect of being on the front lines of this movement for a long time in a pretty vulnerable space was, doing something like recording what would become a feature-length documentary film. How did you manage the relationships on people? How did that kind of evolve?
Mm-hmm. That was probably one of the most dynamic aspects of making this film, because there were many, many people involved with the blockade. And although there were key people and characters that we followed, that continued to evolve and change. And so we had to, first of all, continue having good relationships with different people within the movement that had different perspectives. Then there was the aspect of being on good relations with the RCMP. So for that, we really tried to distinguish that we were separate. We were not, even though we looked like we were out hiking and you could easily mistake us to be part of the blockade because we were so embedded and we were living out of our vehicles to be as close to the film as possible and close to the story as possible. We had press badges to really distinguish that we were separate. And we had to forge new relationships with many of the RCMP every week, because they would come on site for a 7-day rotation. And so that rotation would turn over and we would have to kind of restart those relationships with them. Same thing with the blockade. Many people would come. Some would stay for months. Some would maybe come for a week and then leave. And if we had left for a week and came back, there'd be different people there. So we had to kind of play with this dynamic nature of keeping up to date and keeping speed with all these folks. But it wasn't just on the ground. We were also in all of their chat groups. There would be urban actions that would happen in the city. We'd go to those just to kind of keep up and show that face, because it felt like things in the blockade were happening at a very rapid pace. And so we had to be there all the time to stay relevant and to show that we were, continuing these relationships. And at the same time, we had to really make it clear that we weren't, participating in the blockade actions. We weren't building, we weren't standing in a line to get arrested. We were there as documentary filmmakers. So it was this delicate dance that was ongoing all throughout the course of filming.
How did that second part of the dance, the kind of maintaining some distance from the protesters while still being in the same space as them, how did that play out? What was it like cultivating those relationships, if you will, with the RCMP? Certainly a lot of the press coverage at the time and even later decisions came out about things like exclusion zones that the RCMP used. People were very critical of some of the tactics used, even in relation to the media. And I'm wondering if you can talk to me about your experience of that firsthand.
For sure. I think the first thing is that I just entered with empathy for all parties involved, and knowing that at a, base level, everyone is a human with their own emotions here. And so how can I have empathy for each person involved? But there was different approaches, with folks at the blockade. Many of them were going through like sleep deprivation. They were getting their belongings stolen, their cars towed for very expensive tow prices. They were putting themselves through these extremes, and they were at the blockade for their own personal motivations to take a stand for something they believed in. And so to show that, to build those relationships, I really had to empathize and understand the extent that really brought them to that place, and tap into the part within me where I also had, feelings of my own beliefs or similar beliefs. I also felt a connection being in those forests, for example. With the RCMP, I had to kind of have that framework of they're there for a job. And even if they did things that were pretty intense, as you see in the film, there are scenes of them pepper spraying people, especially like targeting folks who were not white. A lot of Indigenous folks got targeted a lot more by the RCMP. Even if there was actions I disagreed with, I had to try to hold the frame of they're there for their job. And so I need them to see me in the light of I'm there for my job. And my job is that I'm a filmmaker, I'm a journalist, and I'm documenting at the blockades. And so just kind of it was tricky at times when I had to be in conversation with both parties in the same place. So that's where there would have to just be a little bit of relationship building on both ends, because there were times where some of the activists would question, like, how close are you getting to the cops? You shouldn't be talking to them that much. Or where the RCMP would be like, oh, why do you have a pseudo camp name like the other blockaders? Where, are you really a filmmaker or are you an activist? So we had to kind of constantly be just adjusting to what was happening in whatever given moment.
You highlight in the film a little bit some of the politics involved in the situation and how they were playing out while we were still kind of in the active timeline of waiting for injunctions and new media coverage constantly coming out. Some of that included what was going on in the Pachidat Nation, the chief and the band council, and then on the other side of it, maybe Elder Bill Jones. And I'm wondering if you could just tell me, how did you perceive all of that playing out from the front lines of the blockade movement?
Mm-hmm. It was definitely a very complicated time. You know, the Pachidat First Nation is a very small nation in this community in Port Renfrew. It's quite remote. And the nation themselves, from what I understand, rely a lot on logging to support their community. A lot of revenue from that industry is what, you know, does basic things that a lot of us take for granted. It allows them to have a grocery store open year round or a gas station. And so it was complicated within the nation. It's a small, like I mentioned, a small nation, and they have different opinions. And there was a moment when the chief and council publicly released a letter where they asked the blockaders to leave. And that moment happened about 7 months into the blockade. And so that was when it was really like formalized that the nation does not want the blockade to be there. And at that point, the blockade had just grown quite a bit. The injunction was already in place, but enforcement hadn't started yet. And so it became this complicated thing of, do we stay? Do we go? And Elder Bill Jones, was very much like, anyone who is here with a good intention and a good heart to protect these forests is welcome here. And I don't feel like I'm here to say whether that is right or wrong. I think there's a lot of nuance to this subject matter, and that there's people that would have different opinions, that if the nation asked them to leave, those folks should have left. Other people that would say, well, if the community elder says stay, you should stay. And I think our, position as a filmmaking team is to just try to lay out what happened and for the viewer to really make their own opinion on that. We did want to interview the nation, but they respectfully declined that. So we do show a few news clips that kind of fill in the gaps of that part of the story. But for the most part, our interviews with Bill Jones kind of speak a little bit about his perspective, just being at the blockade and what it means to have people come and protect the forests.
What do you think you experienced being there and making the film that people wouldn't have been able to get about the situation if they were just following along in the media reporting?
Mm-hmm. No, great question. I feel that if you're just following along in the media reporting, there was kind of a few different main threads. You had the RCMP would release daily their, arrest count, how many people were arrested in what location, very statistical. And then from the blockade, there was obviously their own media messaging they had developed, which was very much just, we are here to save the last old growth. This is the last stand. When you're on the ground, you really we got to see just all the inner workings, all the just intricacies that happen behind the scenes to make this happen. And just some of the extremes that people went to, the different subtleties that happen within leadership, especially in a movement that is said to be decentralized, but then seeing that actually there is leadership involved. And the main thing is that there's a lot of internal tension that ends up happening, not only at Fairy Creek, but in all of these types of movements. From what I hear, many of them go through a similar kind of process where it can hit a breaking point and there's disagreements, because what ends up happening is a community gets formed. And like any community, people have different opinions. And so what was happening on the ground, and, maybe the messaging they put out is not necessarily what everyone at Fairy Creek believed in. There was very different opinions out there. And it made for just very fascinating observation of human culture in general.
Midcoast Morning is made possible by the Community Radio Fund of Canada and generous listeners like you. Support and grow our nonprofit newsroom project today at chly.ca/donate with a monthly or one-time donation. With your support, we can expand Midcoast Morning from 2 to 3 original programs per week to cover local news, current affairs, and arts and culture.
A documentary telling stories from the front lines of the blockade at Fairy Creek is coming to Nanaimo. Called Fairy Creek, the film is built around footage recorded on location at the protests northeast of Port Renfrew, which began in 2020. I spoke with filmmaker Jen Muranetz ahead of the documentary's theatrical run in the Harbor City. What were some of the parts of this that you wish you were able to cover or to include that you either just didn't have the time for, had to leave on the cutting room floor, or just there was no way to kind of get that footage?
Mm-hmm. I guess just kind of dovetailing off that last comment, I do wish we could have shown a little bit more of that internal tension, but I know that was delicate and that a lot of people didn't want to be witnessed in those moments, or we just weren't physically there with our cameras when it would unfold. That was a challenging thing, is that the blockade grew rapidly. There was more than a dozen camps. These camps were spread out across many, kilometers of logging roads, some of them 2 or 3 hours apart from one another. And so we couldn't physically be at every location at every time. And so, that's a challenge in itself. I also do wish that I was able to get some of the earlier moments with the loggers and the forestry workers. We do have some from that first day. We have some moments throughout, but we always just happen to show up at a camp, and it would be, there had been forestry workers there the day before, and then the day we show up, they weren't there. And so we just had to kind of roll with it and know that we had, strong footage, some strong scenes with forestry workers to show their perspective. But I would say that was something that I wish I could have brought that in a little bit more. We did have a mill worker who, gave us a whole tour of his mill and had a chance to really share his perspective. And I think that's really strong and a great addition to the film. But that is something that if I could have just had that a little bit more to just bring in those different perspectives, that would have been perhaps just a different light it would have brought to the film.
We're now a few years out from Fairy Creek being everywhere in the headlines, in the news. What do you think maybe the legacy is of what took place there? Yeah, I feel like Fairy Creek is not going to be forgotten anytime soon. Just like Clayoquot Sound, which happened more than 30 years ago, is still in people's minds of, what a mass amount of people were able to achieve. I think Fairy Creek is going to have that similar legacy. I feel like some of the internal tensions or things that I spoke to are going to fall by the wayside for many. I feel like what will be known is that Fairy Creek was successful in creating deferrals across the province, in stopping old growth logging. Now that itself is a bit complicated. People who are really into kind of the science and understand this, or maybe are more from the conservationalist lens, will say that that's, there's problems within that. I'm not exactly a person that's an expert in all those stats and facts, but I do think it will be remembered that Fairy Creek was a movement that had, thousands of people come out, and they did collectively, they were able to collectively stop logging in a specific region. Why do you think the movement gathered so much steam and became this big flashpoint? I really feel like it was a rare moment in time was part of it. If you recall, it was 2020 when Fairy Creek happened, the summer of 2020, and the COVID pandemic was maybe about 6 months in. And this was a place that people could come, they could gather outside without a number count of people, and they could, put their energy into something where they had purpose. They could feel belonging. They could be part of something that was larger than themselves. And there was this just enough steam that picked up that it became, I think, very clear within the public opinion that going to Fairy Creek was a good thing. That was kind of a sense that I saw all across the island. And so I do feel like that moment in time was really helpful to get the movement to get to the size that it was. And at the same time, there was not, some of these other larger things happening in the world. Nowadays, we see protests that are happening for different kinds of movements. And I think there wasn't another one at that time that was really grabbing people's attention, because the focus culturally at the time was on the pandemic. And so that's kind of like just a suspicion. It's not something I have grounded in fact, but it's like my observation is I think people really wanted to go out and be able to be part of something and have purpose. And you were able to capture that. You were able to put together this documentary. It's played already a bit on the film festival circuit. And now the reason that we're talking is that it's coming to Nanaimo. It's going to be playing in the cinemas for a week. You're going to be going to some screenings in Vancouver. What would you like people to take away from seeing your documentary?
Yeah, it's really exciting to get to this point where we are showing it in theaters across Canada in limited theaters. And I really want people to go and just feel the immersion into what it was like to be part of a movement that so many people decided to get involved in, and for them to step away from that with their own questions and feelings around activism, or if they don't identify with activism, around just putting their energy into something that they believe in. So I want it to be a place of reflection at the end. I'm not necessarily telling the viewers to believe one thing or the other. I want them to go there and have the like immersive, visceral experience of being at the blockade, and to ideally exit the film with questions of their own around, what does it mean to be in relation to land? What does it mean to take a stand for something that you believe in? What is your power and positionality within that? And so those are some questions, and I'm sure more questions will come from it from each person based on their own experience.
And it's not every week, it's not every month, I feel like, even that there is a movie documenting something that happened on Vancouver Island that is playing on the big screen in Nanaimo. I'm just wondering if you could tell me what the journey to getting the film into theaters locally was like.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have a distributor. They're called Cinema Politica, and they're based in Montreal, and they really focus on, grassroots, activist political films, and they have relationships with theaters. And so our focus as filmmakers is we really knew that this was an island story, and we wanted the film to screen on the island and not just in, one center, in multiple centers. And so we have screenings happening in Nanaimo, but we also have screenings happening in Victoria. And these all kick off on June 6th. We have some special guests who will be present for some of the screenings as well. We also have screenings in Vancouver, on Lasqueti Island. There's one screening, and more to come that are still being finalized. So we have a website, fairycreekfilm.com, where we're updating it regularly with all of the screenings and how people can get tickets and how they can even request for it to come to their community.
Is there anything else you think it's important that people know about the film, your experience making it, or even just the issues involved?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it's important for people to know that, making a film like this is not necessarily an easy one. There were many different opinions involved, and Fairy Creek, as joyful as it was shown in the media at times, it was also a very challenging place to be. It was a lot of people left with a lot of wounds, a lot of trauma, a lot of things that happened to them, and their nervous systems got really rocked. And I think it's really important to know that when they go to see this film, that they're seeing people's stories on screen. And some of those might be people that live in their communities, or that they know, or their friends know. And so I just invite people to have just a level of empathy in that. And I hope that when they watch the film, they're able to feel the realness that came through from that moment in time.
Did you kind of have any relationships after the fact with some of the folks who are chronicled in the film? As I said at one point, really, it feels like the spine, the backbone of the film is what was going on the front lines. A lot of people are profiled, people who were kind of doing things like in some way adhesing themselves, sticking themselves into some kind of hard to get out of contraption. A lot of really up close and raw encounters, even sometimes when the RCMP came to kind of extract people out from places they had put themselves. Did you have a relationship with some of the people who you show those encounters with in the documentary after the fact? And did you kind of suss out their vibe for how they felt it came out, or how they feel even just about being kind of on screen in this kind of forever way?
Yeah, definitely. Every single person who was on camera, I tried to have some kind of relationship with. It really depended. If someone was in, a couple scenes, I maybe didn't have as much of a relationship with them. But anyone that you see consistently, I was in some form of communication with them after filming. And I would sometimes joke that it almost felt like I was in 20 relationships at any given time, just the amount of, texting and calling and kind of keeping people up to speed. And majority of the people have seen the film now. There's still a few folks who haven't seen it. And for those that have seen it, it was, many of them were like, thank you for showing our story. And, some of them had questioned some of the edit choices we made. But I know that when we sat in that edit room, that we were really trying to make sure that no one was being depicted in a way that they didn't actually present themselves. We wanted them to be shown the way that they represented themselves. And so at the end of the day, everyone was like, you really did the movement justice. And so I feel that was a good part. And especially people who said, you showed the faults of it as well in some moments and some of the troubles. And that was also important. And so, yeah, that was a little bit of the feedback that we received.
Jen Muranetz is director of Fairy Creek, a documentary filmed during the logging blockade that started in 2020. The doc is playing in Nanaimo at the Landmark Cinema starting this Friday. It also has showtimes in Victoria, Vancouver, and on Lasqueti Island. That's our show for the day. Thank you for joining me. I'm Joe Pugh, host and producer of Midcoast Morning. Jesse Woodward is our executive producer, and Arby Fruit is our technical advisor. You can sign up for CHLY's newsletter at chly.ca/subscribe. You can also find more news at chly.ca/news. If you have a story you'd like us to cover, email us at news@chly.ca. Our theme song is First One by local Nanaimo band Waste Management. That's all for now. I'll talk to you on another Midcoast Morning.
Midcoast Morning would not be possible without the funding of the Community Radio Fund of Canada's Radio Meters program and listeners like you. Midcoast Morning is a project of CHLY's nonprofit newsroom. Support nonprofit journalism in Nanaimo and on the Salish Sea today by becoming a monthly sustaining donor at $5 or more per month. Support the program at chly.ca/donate. If you're already a supporter, record a voice memo telling others where you're listening from and why they too should support our work. After you're done, you can email it to us. Also, share the podcast with your friends. While Meta is blocking Canadian users from sharing news content on their Facebook feeds, you can still share our podcast directly with your friends via Facebook or Instagram Messenger. Finally, this program acknowledges and gives thanks to the Nanaimo First Nation as we broadcast and podcast from their traditional territory. Thanks for listening.